Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. We're going to get started in just a couple minutes, so hang on there. We're just letting people kind of arrive. Hello to everybody who's joining. We'll get started in just another minute or so, just waiting for last few people to show up. Okay, great. Let's get started. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining. Welcome to Learning to Learn by Teaching, presented by Kat Cosgrove. My name is Spoons. I'm the Chief Architect at Lightstep, and I'm going to be moderating today's talk. Today's talk is part of 99% Visible DevOps Reliability, a series of talks about building and operating reliable software applications and about the organizations that do that. I'll talk about what's coming up next in our series at the end of the presentation. Before we get started, a couple of things. Today's talk is being recorded, and we'll share a link to the recording with everyone who signed up for the session. So you can, if you have to step out, you can watch it later or share it with friends. And speaking of signing up, we'd love to hear, if you would like to hear about future talks, please head over to 99%devops.com. If you're tweeting about today's talk, which I encourage everyone to do, we'd love to see you using the hashtag 99%visible. That's 99%visible. So the plan for today, after I finish the little introduction, is I'll hand things over to Kat. We've budgeted about 30 or 40 minutes for the talk, and then we'll save some time at the end to take questions. So if you do have questions during the talk, please use Zoom's Q&A feature. I think the button's down here somewhere for most people. Anyway, you can submit questions along the way, and then we'll try to get to those at the end. And one last thing before we get started, I wanted to thank our sponsors, Lightstep, Ambassador, Blameless, CodeFresh, Rollbar, and Noble9. We all know that DevOps is more than tools, but tools like these can be effective ways of kickstarting a new DevOps practice or continuing to build the practice already within your organization. And that brings me sort of to the subject of today's presentation. So Kat's going to be talking about learning and teaching, things that are really close to my heart. I spent a long time in academia, and one of the reasons I like giving talks and things like that in this space as well is because I like teaching and I like learning from other people. And so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Kat for her to do her presentation. Looking forward to it. Thanks, Kat.
Hello, y'all. Share my screen. Here we go. So thanks for having me, everyone, and welcome to the talk. It turns out that teaching is actually really hard, which is something, I mean, I knew it was difficult, but the specific ways in which it was difficult, I didn't really figure out until I started doing it all the time instead of just tutoring people. And hopefully I can save you some trouble in the future because you're all going to have to do this at some point. First of all, my name is Kat Cosgrove, and I am a developer advocate at JFrog. For the people asking about the cat, her name is Espresso. You will almost certainly hear her in the background at some point, and she may climb up into my lap because she is very needy and she loves attention. So, bear with me. Anyway, being a developer advocate means that ultimately my job is to teach people things. And over the last year and some change, I have given dozens of talks and workshops about DevOps, the majority of them educational in nature, not like product pitches for my employer. And the way I approach developer education has changed pretty radically over that period of time. In some ways, it's more difficult for me, but it's better for my audience in every conceivable way. The assumptions I make are different now, and the way I communicate has also changed. There's like a persistent saying that you don't truly understand something until you can teach it to somebody else, which I very, very much agree with. So in the spirit of that, I am going to try to teach you what I've learned in my time teaching developers, and then hopefully all of our jobs will get a little bit easier, even if it's not also your job to teach developers. There is time at the end for questions, but if you would like to get a hold of me later, that is doable. You can find me on Twitter at Dixie3Flatline, where you will also find more pictures of the cat, or you can email me at cat.cosgrove@gmail.com, but definitely Twitter is a more reliable way to get a hold of me. I am not good at checking my emails. Sorry. All right, so let's get in there. I write almost nothing but intro level 101 content these days. That is like definitely my my niche. And there's this kind of persistent idea that intro level content is easy to write because it isn't a technical deep dive. And thinking this way is a mistake. It's only true if you're writing bad intro level content. And that's what I was writing at first, really early, to be fair. This is how most of us write at first. You can crank out a high level overview of something in like half a day, pat yourself on the back for it, and get some praise from your boss. But your boss isn't the one who needs to love that content. They don't need to get value out of it. The people who don't know anything about whatever technology you're trying to explain, they're your audience. And that changes some things. It means that you can't just crank out a high level overview in half a day without thinking about it. You have to put actual thought and effort into it. And unfortunately, that's not something that's like super intuitive. You just assume that people understand things the way you understand them. And that's not true. So like I said, I wrote this way at first. I am absolutely guilty of this. So don't feel like I'm, picking on you if you do this too. But then I started actually paying attention to the different ways my students learned. Not everybody learns the same way. And then the specific questions that they asked and the things that seemed to be coming up repeatedly. I am currently of the opinion that if I'm getting the same question over and over and over again, that's not a failure of my students. That's a failure of my content. If people are consistently asking me the same question, I didn't explain myself very well. And every observation like this that I made resulted in some change to the way that I now go about writing even like super duper introductory content. And as a result, introductory content is now the most difficult thing I do. It's extremely time consuming when it's well done, at least. It's very difficult to write. You have to question yourself constantly, but it's also considerably more valuable, and you get the warm fuzzies of actually helping people instead of just hitting your KPIs or whatever. And you might be thinking to yourself, but Kat, I'm not a developer advocate. I'm not an evangelist. I'm not a developer educator. It isn't my job to teach people things. Why should I care about this? I've got some news for you. It actually is on y'all too. It's on us as a community. Until DevOps trade schools and boot camps become a thing, or universities start teaching these technologies too, because currently they don't, we have to take teaching this stuff into our own hands. Some people already have. There are people like me whose actual job it is. And then there are some great books out there, random people doing workshops, just software engineers functioning as content creators, like putting tutorials on like dev.to or whatever, just because they want to. And that's great. But we can't solve this problem without some help. And that help has to come from y'all. It has to come from your company as a whole. It has to come from your individual organizations. It has to come from your teams. My cat is crying in the background. So if you have the energy for it, mentor somebody in your spare time. Make yourself available to answer questions and make it clear that none of those questions are stupid. I ask stupid questions all the time because I'm not afraid of it, but new people are afraid of it. They're afraid of looking stupid. So they might not ask the question unless you make it very clear that they're not going to get judged for it. It could be a junior engineer on another team at your company, talk to somebody at like a local coding boot camp or a university program, or just some random person off of Twitter, whatever. And this is especially true for like senior engineers and technical leads. If you are letting your junior teammates struggle longer than necessary, like everybody needs to struggle like a little bit, you have to at least try to figure it out on your own. But if you're letting them just bash their head into the keyboard, you're kind of being a crappy teammate. You're actively detrimental to your organization at that point. And frankly, you're not doing your job. As a senior engineer, one of your responsibilities is to function as a mentor for the juniors on your team. It's like actually part of your job. And doing things otherwise is wasting time. DevOps is about reducing time wasted, right? So don't waste time with your junior engineers either. We can't really allow things to continue as they are. A lot of this stuff we struggled to learn ourselves, but that's not a reason to keep things this way, you know? So you might not be a developer advocate, but teaching is still your job in some capacity, and this talk is still for you. At some point, you are going to have to teach someone how to do something, and it's better for all of us if you don't make the same mistakes that I did. So far, the most common stumbling blocks that I've noticed are jargon and people not understanding the why. I'm going to cover the jargon first by talking about two things that you are probably not familiar with. This works better if you're not familiar with them, though I'm sure somebody in the crowd is familiar with one of them. Still, they're weird enough that I expect it to come out of left field for a lot of you. We're going to start with fencing. So fencing is an Olympic sport with 3 different styles, and all of them have different rules: foil, epee, and saber. This is an actual sport. It's not a martial art. It's been around for a long time now. You've probably only ever seen it at the Olympics, though. And regardless of which weapon you fence, the definition of attack is always the same. People who do not fence are almost never able to define this correctly. So go ahead and take a moment and think about it. Try to guess what you think an attack is in fencing. I'm not going to do a super long pause, but I am going to make you think for like another 5 seconds. Okay. So you might think that an attack is any action intended to score a touch or a point against your opponent. This is actually not correct. The attack is the initial offensive action made by extending the arm and continuously threatening the opponent's target, preceding the launching of the lunge or flesh. On the surface, that kind of makes sense even if you don't know anything about fencing. The words do go together, and you understand that it's the first offensive action a fencer takes, if they're sticking their arm out at least and aggressively threatening the opponent without doing any hedging or making any defensive motions before. What? You can guess what a lunge is. You probably do know what a lunge is, but what does flesh mean? We have jargon in our jargon at this point, and in this case, it's actually not a huge problem because fencers do know what a flesh is. All of them know what a flesh is. They learned that pretty early. And also, the sport is really old. All of the domain-specific language here is established, and it has been for a very long time. This is one Google search if you don't know what it is. So it's not a big deal. And fencing gets away with this because in a lot of cases, the language used to talk about the sport hasn't changed in a century. DevOps technologies, though, those change year over year. We have technologies to provide abstractions for technologies that are abstractions of things that didn't exist 10 years ago. You know, we can't do that and expect newbies to understand quickly, just like I can't expect you to understand the next example because this one is way more arcane. Goats. We're going to talk about esports. Does anyone know what goats means in the context of video games? This one is virtual. I can't wait to do this live. This is virtual, so I can't make eye contact with you, but I'm going to pretend that a couple of you do know what I'm referring to and have indicated that with like a smirk and like a little what's up head nod at me. I want to talk to the people who don't, but hello to the people who do. Overwatch is a first-person shooter by Blizzard with a robust competitive professional scene. In Overwatch, the term GOATs refers to a specific composition of heroes playable in the game, originally consisting of 3 tanks, which is a hero with lots of health who may move slowly and doesn't really do a ton of damage. Their job is to like soak up damage and protect the healers and the damage characters. And then 3 healers with 0 damage characters in the lineup. So just 3 tanks, 3 healers. The origin of this specific piece of jargon is kind of weird though. You might guess that it stands for greatest of all time, which is, you know, a fairly common turn of phrase used to describe an athlete who's particularly talented. We see it all the time in traditional sports and in, you know, all other areas of life. However, this actually refers to the name of a team called GOATs, who first popularized this particular composition and made a run through the bracket of Overwatch contenders, Blizzard's semi-professional league. It was unstoppable at the time, and so the composition was named after the team. Now, this is not user-friendly at all. This has layers of things that you have to understand. Unlike the example from fencing, GOATs gives you 0 indication of what it could possibly mean. So when Blizzard wanted to expand viewership of Overwatch League to a more like casual audience through streaming partnerships with ESPN and Disney, they had to do away with the term GOATs because it didn't mean anything unless you were there for the birth of it. Shoutcasters for matches were instructed to call the composition 3-3 instead, because it means what it says, 3 tanks and 3 healers, rather than needing a whole bunch of lore about semi-professional Overwatch competitions from, at this point, 3.5 years ago, to know what it means when somebody says, hey, let's go GOATs. Now, mainstream esports is in its infancy. Like, yes, it's been a thing for a while, but as a mainstream concept that you can just watch on TV, it's very, very young. And it feels like we get a new piece of slang once a month. It's easy for me to pick it up because I've been involved for a long time and I have the context. That's not true for people trying to get into watching it casually. The term was a barrier for entry that didn't need to be there, so Blizzard got rid of it. The same thing has to go for DevOps. Like Blizzard in the Overwatch League, if we want people to use our tools and understand what we're teaching them and move to a more DevOps way of doing things at their companies, we have to make it involve fewer hurdles. We have to make this cleaner and simpler and easier to understand. Just using more descriptive words or going out of our way a little bit to clearly define the domain-specific words we use goes a long way towards making this stuff more approachable. An experienced engineer moving over from a completely unrelated field to yours or trying your tool for the first time still needs to be considered a newbie. They are absolutely newbies. So if we all just put in like a tiny bit more work to define the jargon when we use it and do away with things that don't make sense on the surface, we make our products and our ways of doing things far more easily adoptable, which makes all of our jobs easier, especially if you have to justify your salary to the marketing department like I do. So the amount of jargon in the tech industry is absolutely bonkers, and we tend to kind of use it with wild abandon, even in like intro level educational content. We rarely define what we mean. We frequently do this without considering that it might have another meaning. Like, for instance, the many definitions and usages of the word Docker. Like, we call it a Docker container, but it's not actually a Docker container. DevOps and cloud native are actually especially bad about this, mostly because of the Docker thing. And like, jargon has its place. It does for people who are on the same page. In that case, it does make communication more concise, which is definitely valuable, but we're talking about teaching people. And for junior developers or newbies, it's just confusing. It makes understanding what the hell we're doing here far more difficult than it really needs to be. And like, you might be thinking to yourself, but Kat, they can just Google it. Why we shouldn't just hand everything to them? Why should I explain it? Make them Google it. Why not? Like, we shouldn't hand everything to them because it wasn't handed to us. Like, we build tools and practices that make it so that we don't have to deal with the pain points we feel when building software. So why is it acceptable or even like sometimes encouraged to keep it difficult to learn and communicate about these things? This makes your content less approachable and less useful. If you're giving a tutorial or talking to a new teammate, the first time you use an acronym or a piece of jargon, just define it. I've already done it several times in this talk, actually. Take a few extra seconds and make sure that you're on the same page instead of making everyone go Google it. The example from Overwatch is a jargon problem, but it's also a context problem. It's an issue of understanding the why. And context is also something that's important to keep in mind when you're trying to educate developers. They may not understand the why for a particular method or a particular tool set. And it turns out that knowing why something is useful is actually super important for being able to understand it. You see, a lot of this stuff is actually really new in the grand scheme of things. The first commercially available successful serverless platform was AWS Lambda, which came out in 2014. And now there's more of them you can shake a stick at. Plus, we've got some, serverless databases for good measure. Just 4 years ago, Linkerd and the concept of a service mesh did not exist. But today, in 2021, it's hard for some people to imagine a world without one. This industry and the technology we use changes really, really, really rapidly. We have layers upon layers upon layers of abstraction between us and our code now. And more teams across an organization are expected to have some level of familiarity with these things. So to you or me, an expert, maybe with years of experience and a job title with the word DevOps in it, it's possible that this is a change that you haven't really noticed. It's happened, it's felt natural, right? Like a slow progression building on the things that you started with. And you can remember when these things were born, right? You remember the first instance, the first iteration of these tools and the concepts that led to those tools. So we have all of the context and like adjacent domain specific knowledge that makes picking up new tools easier because we understand the why. Like we get the specific ways in which things were harder before this. We've personally experienced it. So a high level definition of something like a service mesh is enough for us. It's immediately clear how this could make our lives easier. This is even kind of a problem with things that have been around for a relatively long time, like continuous integration or package managers. They've become ubiquitous, and you can teach someone how to use Jenkins or NPM or whatever without knowing where they came from, but it's still helpful to know what release cycles used to look like or how difficult it used to be to install a piece of software. The people you're teaching don't have this context. They don't understand why. Saying a service mesh is a dedicated infrastructure layer for facilitating service-to-service communications between services or microservices using a proxy, often as a sidecar, does not help anyone who isn't already pretty well informed. It has no place in 101 level content. You and I might understand it. I actually don't understand that super well, and this is my job. But it turns out that people who are just now learning what DevOps is don't know what any of that means. And we're trying to teach them, we're not trying to remind ourselves. So the language we use has to be different here. So what does this look like for me in practice now? Well, writing this kind of content takes a lot longer. When I use an acronym or any kind of shorthand or for something else, I define it the first time. If I have to mention another piece of technology in the process of defining something else, I have to go explain that piece of technology too. I do try to keep it brief, and if it's not something that I can keep brief, I will link out to another like external resource that explains it. If that means including a little bit of a history lesson on the way, for instance, like software updates worked before cruise control was first a thing, I will do that. For workshops, it means including a glossary in the accompanying GitHub repo with the starter code. That is a lot of work and requires like constant maintenance. Sometimes if it's brand new content that I'm not super sure about, I'll even just like borrow some students from the local coding bootcamp and use them as a test audience. That is really extra though. You don't have to do that. I really don't think it's necessary, but it helps me personally. And also it helps the students because they get, they get free content that they didn't pay for, and one-on-one like hands-on time with me to ask questions and try to deep dive further. And it's beneficial for both of us, right? My content improves and they learn something new. If I'm teaching something hands-on, I've also found that it's worth the effort to show something closer to a real world use case. For instance, when I teach people about CI/CD, I don't just walk them through a hello world pipeline and call it good. They get a whole talk on the history of CI/CD, from Grady Booch coining the term in the early 90s to the invention of cruise control, to Jenkins, to cloud solutions that we have today, like Circle CI, Travis, and that kind of stuff. And then I have them go through the process of manually building, tagging, and pushing a containerized Flask applications and an actual functioning like Python web server that does a little thing. They have to do it all manually. And then I have them walk through setting up CI/CD to do all of that for them automatically. So this way, the people I'm teaching have done it both ways. They've personally experienced how this is helpful. Like, can you still do it manually? Yeah, totally. But with this small amount of effort at the beginning when you're setting up a project, there's a whole host of things that you don't have to worry about anymore. Like, isn't it better to just write code and push it? And now they understand like specifically how that is better. I also have stopped using terminal aliases. I don't alias anything in my terminal anymore. There are a couple that are there just to be cute, like sudo being alias to please, but I never, ever, ever do that in a live coding demo. People are trying to follow along with you, and getting cute or using shortcuts that for you personally enhance productivity isn't actually helpful. It's just confusing. I learned pretty quickly that it's common to overestimate how much your audience understands about like using the terminal. At first, when I started doing workshops, I was assuming that everybody functionally knew how to use the terminal, how like the basics of Linux commands, but that is just not true. It just isn't. A ton of people working as developers or who are developer adjacent and may still be interested in your product and want to learn how to use it, they don't know how to use the terminal. Some of them don't even know how to open it. So you do have to really like dial back your expectations and assume a less than the bare minimum of knowledge. I also tend to question absolutely everything I say when I'm writing intro content. Every single statement comes with me asking to myself, like, am I giving them enough context? Did I explain this thoroughly enough that someone with absolutely zero understanding of this entire section of tech would get it? Are my words simple and clear? really can't make assumptions about what people know if you're trying to teach something. You just can't. I would love to. It makes things much easier, but you can't do it. So unless you have a personal relationship with the person you're teaching and you're very aware of the context they have, treat them like they have none. If it's in a like 101 or like one-on-one or like a very small group context, you can just ask, say, do you know how to do this? And most people are not offended or bothered by that. I genuinely appreciate it when people ask whether or not I understand a particular technology or a particular concept rather than just assuming, because we all have knowledge gaps, right? Like none of us is an expert in everything, and very few of us are truly masters of even a couple of things. I've been writing Python for years, but I still have to like check the docs for specific syntax sometimes, and that's normal. So why would we make assumptions about what newbies know? So, Kat, that sounds like a huge pain. And yes, it is. Definitely. It's a real big pain. There is a lot of extra work for me in this, but it's better than making the people that I'm trying to teach struggle unnecessarily. This is the difference between the good intro level content I write now and the easy for me, but bad for learners content that I wrote 2 years ago. So no, I can't crank out a new piece of 101 content in half a day anymore. It takes me usually a couple of weeks, because I'll write it and go through it and write it and go through it and send it to somebody else to look at, and on and on and on. And that's if it's something that I don't have to learn much about myself anymore. But the result here is that the content I teach is immediately useful, it's immediately actionable, and the people I'm teaching feel respected and cared for. Nobody's time is being wasted, and I get to feel good about putting something out into the world that is actually helpful. So like, DevOps exists so that we don't have to suffer through the same problems with writing and delivering software that we did before, right? Every single new tool, every new technique, every new strategy, it exists to solve some kind of pain point. But we're kind of letting these problems with the way we teach it hang around. We're solving the problems like with software, with computers, but we're ignoring the people problem, and how we teach things is a major people problem. So change the way you teach, change the way you talk to people, change the way you mentor if that's something that you do. This takes a little bit more effort on your part, a lot on my part because it's my full-time job, but just a little bit for you. But it's better in the long run for all of us. People pick up our tools more quickly, people adopt our way of doing things more quickly, people understand more readily. That's not just good for them, that takes some stuff off of your plate too. So here's what I want y'all to do. I want you to try to remember what it was like when you were new yourself, when you were the last time you learned something that was difficult and completely alien to you. And that might be kind of hard to do. Humans are actually really, really good at forgetting these things, which is one of the struggles with writing 101 content. You forget what it's like to not know things. And that's totally okay. It's natural. It'll take some effort to do this. But think about the things that you struggled with, and think about how long it took you to feel like you were an expert in anything at all, or even just like functional. Because I'm still not really comfortable calling myself an expert in things until somebody else refers to me as an expert in something. And think about how, like, the way you were taught, is that actually what works well for you? Because the way I was taught, it turns out is not what works well for me. I was taught to just memorize things. It was a rote memorization thing, and I can't do that. That doesn't work. I need a hands-on workshop. I need to try it myself. I need tutorials with code samples and explicit technical documentation. I can't just be told to memorize something. But some people do love just memorizing something. So keep that in mind, that we don't all learn the same way, and we have to be cognizant of that. And we do all know what it's like to struggle with something, so there is still some shared human experience in there for us. Just give it a try. Change the way you speak a little bit. Define the terms you use. Give people the why is this tool helpful, not just what it is, because the why is not always obvious. And some of the shorthand we use is also like super arcane. Thank you for coming to see me. I would also like to thank Lightstep for hosting this, and all of the fancy sponsors, and specifically Lightstep's principal developer advocate, Austin, for being a stone cold fox. I'll be around answering questions for a while. And you can always get a hold of me on Twitter at Dixie3Flatline. I will now toss it back to the hosts.
Cool. Yeah, if I was Austin, I would have some cool sound effects to play right now, but I'll just actually clap. Thanks. That was great.
Thank you.
Let's see here. So yeah, there are a couple of questions. If other folks have questions, you can use the feature, and I'll try to moderate a little bit.
Sure.
So the first one that's here is, what do you do if you don't know the skill set or the knowledge of your audience?
If you don't know the knowledge or the skill set of your audience, you make the assumption that they know the least. In my experience, experts are rarely bothered that you took the extra 3 seconds to define a word you're using. They don't care. It's 3 seconds. That's not going to offend anyone. Nobody's going to feel like you're insulting their intelligence by taking the time to define a term. But people who don't know really appreciate it, because if you don't explain that, they can't understand you. And if you want to be understood, then you assume that there is somebody in the audience who doesn't know what this word is, and you need to define it for them.
Yeah. The follow-up is, how do you find that balance? But it sounds like you find the balance by just making sure that everyone's on the same page.
Yeah, even when I'm speaking at like a DevOps conference about DevOps, I start by defining DevOps as I'm going to use it in the course of that talk,
Sure.
because people are still arguing about what DevOps means.
Yeah,
so
that's true. So even if there's experts that think they know, it doesn't mean that their idea is the same as your idea. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And I think, like you're saying, to really like go through a bunch of the steps manually, like even if you know what these terms are, or if you've used a lot of the tools, like it can still be helpful for experts to see some of those details.
Totally.
Okay, another question. Do you have any tips for handling the imposter syndrome?
It doesn't really go away. It gets easier to identify when what you're feeling is imposter syndrome, but the feeling, at least for me, the feeling has not really stopped. And the way I kind of handle it is, I have a couple of friends who work in a similar field to me, who have considerably more experience than me, that I trust, just like without a second thought. I trust their opinion on things. And so when I can't tell if what I'm feeling is imposter syndrome or not, I will go to them and say, hey, this is what I'm thinking. This is my opinion. Like, am I being an idiot? And I trust these people enough that if they say, no, you're absolutely right, like this is an imposter syndrome, like this person's being stupid, I just believe it, and the feeling goes away. And then if they are like, you're off base here, I also trust them to handle that in a way that doesn't make me feel bad about myself. So
Yeah.
this is you need an imposter syndrome buddy.
No, it's good. I think that makes sense. I was thinking a little bit when you were talking about letting like new folks on your team would bash their heads on the keyboards for a minute or whatever, but not too long. Do you have any advice for those new folks? This is something I feel like I've always struggled with, which is like I don't want them to feel like they have to immediately ask for help like the second that they get stuck on something, but I also don't want them to work for hours on it. Do you have any advice that you feel like works for those folks?
It kind of depends on like the scale of the problem they're struggling with, but generally, like when I'm teaching, I before in the before times, I taught Python to like high school girls for a local nonprofit, and my policy was you can stay stuck for 15 minutes.
Okay.
But that's just like learning Python. There's a much smaller scale problem. So in that case, I say you can stay stuck for 15 minutes, but after that, I expect you to ask me a question, ask me for help. So it depends on what you're doing, but I set a time limit on allowing people to struggle, and then when they do come to me for a question, I don't give them the answer right off the bat. I ask what they've tried and what they have searched for. And then we solve it together. But yeah, let them get stuck for like X amount of time, but make it clear that the expectation is that if they stay stuck longer than that, it is their job to ask questions. I
Yeah.
said that a senior's job is to help teach the juniors, but ultimately the junior's job is to ask questions. So it's a two-way thing.
Yeah, no, I think that's good to set that expectation. Let's see, another question. How do you measure the effectiveness or success of learning materials that you produce? Is there a way to get measurable feedback on, say, a wiki page or a README that you write?
So I don't write wiki pages, but for a lot of stuff, like workshops and webinars I give, if they're for my employer, if they're for JFrog, we send out a survey afterwards that for some reason people actually do fill out. And I do actually use that feedback. I also always export the chat from things like that so that I can go through and like read everything that's going on while I'm talking, because those workshops are 2 hours long. Like I can't read the chat the whole time, but I do read the chat afterwards and take feedback from that. A
Yeah.
lot of the really hands-on content like that, I do borrow, like I will borrow an entire class from a coding boot camp and give them a free workshop. But the trade-off is that they have to sit there and talk to me afterwards with like specific, what was a problem? Like where was I not clear? As for like proving that this stuff is more impactful and more useful after the fact, like for a proving it to your boss kind of situation, I get easily double or triple the registrations and actual attendees of content that isn't this.
Okay. So
So there, it's like yes, it is provably better through the number of attendees I get, the number of registrations I get, the number of like follow-up questions, and then if it is something that is written, how widely it gets shared online.
yeah, yeah, that makes sense. Um, you mentioned this a little bit at the end, talking about different learning styles. Is that something that you think about as you build content, or do you try to find an audience that's more focused toward a particular learning style?
It's something I try to think about, but it's difficult to cram like multiple learning styles into one thing when you're doing like a 2 hour live workshop. So that's why I include, at least in the workshops, they get split up into halves. There's always a lecture half and like a hands-on half. And the hands-on half is written in a way that if you are the type of learner who prefers to just like sit back and absorb it and listen, like doing doesn't help you at all or might actually hinder you, it's still useful, because I do explain in depth what is going on in every situation, in every line of code I write, in every command I have you run. So this is why the workshops are so long, because there's the lecture half, and then there is me still actually technically lecturing while I'm doing a hands-on demo. But that way, at least I capture the people who like to do something and the people who just need to like listen and take notes. Like some people don't learn unless they like write it down physically. So it's valuable for at least those two types of learners.
Yeah.
But it does take effort to cram all of that in.
Yeah, for sure. It sounds Yeah, I mean, I guess and always like I feel it's like easiest to prepare material for my own learning style, and so whenever I'm doing the other ones, I'm like, like.
Oh, it's hard. It's really hard because I am a doer. I don't like taking notes. I have to actually just try the thing myself, and uh, sitting through a lecture puts me to sleep. I I don't know, my brain can't focus on it, and I just like turn off internally, and it doesn't do anything for me. So it is hard to conceptualize other people learning in a way that is foreign to you, but it's true. Like we don't all actually
Right.
benefit from the same teaching styles.
Right, exactly. Cool. Well, I think that's all the questions we had. So I wanted to thank you again. That was a great talk.
Thank you.
And then I wanted to just say a few other things before we wrap up here. Thanks to everyone who was in the audience and joined us today, spent time, or thanks to everyone who's watching the recording. This has been 99% Visible DevOps Reliability. You can find Kat and I online if you want to chat more about this kind of stuff. You can join us next time. We're gonna host another one of these in May, on May 25th. Randy Shoup's going to be talking about learning from incidents and learning from what we learned from those incidents. So a little bit of a theme on what we're talking about today. You can sign up for that and for other updates at 99percentdevops.com. And then before we go, I just wanted to thank our sponsors one more time. Of course, Lightstep, where I work, but also Ambassador, Blameless, CodeFresh, Rollbar, and Noble9. Thanks to all of you that help let us do this. Thanks again to everybody in the audience. I hope you had a good time, and we'll talk to you soon.